The U.S. military plans on spending tens of billions of dollars over 6 years to surround China with missiles, with offensive missiles aimed at waging war on China. But there's one problem in these U.S. war plans. It cannot find a country in the Pacific region that is willing to host these missiles. This is a very significant problem for the U.S. because in order to wage this offensive war on China in the Pacific region on the other side of the planet, the U.S. needs to host these intermediate range missiles. And according to a study that was commissioned by the U.S. military from a Pentagon-backed think tank, 5 major U.S. allies in the Pacific region are not willing to host these missiles. I published an article about this at multipolarista.com. It's called U.S. Wants to Surround China with Missiles, but Can't Find Asian Country to Host Them. And here you can see a photo of U.S. Army ballistic missiles. Now, these are a much older version. These are not the up-to-date modern intermediate range missiles that the U.S. plans to surround China with. I note that the U.S. military commissioned a study from the Rand Corporation. This is a Pentagon-backed think tank, and the study was aimed at assessing the feasibility of deploying intermediate range missiles to the Pacific. And the conclusion was that this is not feasible. Why is that? Because the 5 U.S. treaty allies in the region, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand, are likely not going to host these missiles. The report cited a, quote, inability to find a willing partner, and it noted that the possibility of these countries hosting U.S. ground-based intermediate-range missiles, quote, is very low as long as current domestic political conditions and regional security trends hold. And here is, by the way, this is the study at the Rand Corporation. It is titled Ground-Based Intermediate-Range Missiles in the Indo-Pacific, Assessing the Positions of U.S. Allies. It was written by a political scientist named Jeffrey Hornung. And it is not a very optimistic report. It shows that the U.S. new Cold War on China is facing obstacles. So, an important detail in this that we can't understand the conflict without knowing is that in 2019, the Donald Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from a very important treaty, the INF Treaty, that stands for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This means that because the U.S. withdrew unilaterally from this treaty, the U.S. government can now deploy ground-based missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Those are considered intermediate-ranged missiles. And this Rand Corporation study refers to these weapons as ground-based intermediate-range missiles, GBIRM. And Rand wrote that, quote, finding an ally willing to host GBIRMs, that is ground-based intermediate-range missiles, is more challenging than finding allies willing to host other types of U.S. military forces, such as air bases. Now, why are these countries hesitant about hosting these U.S. missiles? Well, clearly, they're hesitant because they don't want to have a hot war with China. So this is from a quote from the Rand Corporation report. Quote, there are several reasons why U.S. allies could deny access to and use of their territories, including 1, fears that hosting such systems could intensify a regional arms race with China. So these countries don't want to get in an arms race with China. 2, the risk of the deployment being seen as provocative, sparking harsh reactions from Beijing. Obviously, they don't want to start a war with China. And then finally, fears of entrapment in a conflict between the United States and China that does not directly involve the ally. So if the U.S. and China start a war, if the U.S. starts a war with China and there's a conventional war between them, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand don't want to be dragged into this potentially catastrophic conflict. After all, the U.S. is not in the Pacific region. They are in the Pacific region, so they could face consequences from these U.S. wars. So, given the reality that this is unlikely, the Rand Corporation report suggested several other possibilities for militarily encircling China, and one of those is deploying these ground-based intermediate-range missiles to Guam, which is a U.S. colony based in the Pacific region. And it concluded that the most likely approach would be for the U.S. to actually strengthen Japan's military to counter China. Now, I mentioned in the article here at multipolarista.com, that this is part of a U.S. military plan to spend $27.4 billion over 6 years to surround China with missiles. By the way, I should point out that the U.S. has estimated that it could, with $20 billion, it could end poverty and homelessness. So it's not going to end poverty and homelessness. Instead, the U.S. government is spending even more than that money to surround China with missiles for a war with China, a nuclear-armed superpower. Now, there's a major Japanese media outlet named Nikkei, and they published an article about this RAND study, but they also published a more important article back in 2021. Nikkei obtained exclusively a copy of the, quote, Pacific Deterrence Initiative of the U.S. military's Indo-Pacific Command, and this strategy was submitted to Congress in 2021. Here you can see this article at Nikkei Asia, and this article published in March 2021 is titled, U.S. to Build Anti-China Missile Network Along First Island Chain. And this article is very important because it shows that the U.S. military plans for the new Cold War on China are not defensive. They are explicitly offensive, aimed at starting a war with China. And the strategy reveals that the U.S. military plans on spending $27.4 billion over 6 years, and it wants to install precision strike missiles on the first island chain. What is the first island chain? You can see in the map here, it is, as the name suggests, the first chain of islands off of the coast of East Asia. So that includes Japan and Okinawa here, Taiwan, which is part of China, and the Philippines. That is where, you can see in the map, that is where the U.S. military plans on installing a series of offensive, precision strike, intermediate range missiles aimed at waging war on China. And in this strategy that the U.S. military sent to Congress, it makes it clear that the U.S. military sees China as a threat because it's challenging Washington's hegemony in the Pacific. And this is an exact quote from the U.S. military strategy submitted to Congress. Quote, without a valid and convincing conventional deterrent, that is a military threat, quote, China is emboldened to take action in the region and globally to supplant U.S. interests. So China is challenging U.S. interests in the Pacific region, which once again is on the other side of the planet. So the U.S. considers itself the emperor of planet Earth, and because there is a challenge to its unilateral hegemonic empire, it is threatening China with war by putting a bunch of missiles worth tens of billions of dollars on the countries surrounding China. Now, during the Donald Trump administration, his Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, who was, by the way, previously a former vice president of and lobbyist for Raytheon, one of the leading weapons corporation, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper said in a speech in 2019 that the U.S. sought to deploy intermediate-range missiles to the Pacific region, quote, sooner rather than later. And in this report from the Rand Corporation, it emphasized how the Biden corporation, that's a Freudian slip of the tongue there, the Biden administration has considered much of the Trump administration's aggressive policies against China. And the Rand report emphasized, quote, the strategic logic that underlines this thinking did not change with the transition of administrations in Washington. So obviously, the new Cold War on China is completely bipartisan. Biden has continued Trump's policies. And as I note in this article, This May, Secretary of State Antony Blinken gave a historic speech in which he basically announced that the U.S. government has a new policy of containment and siege against China, and that is basically a copy of the U.S. policy of containment and siege against the Soviet Union in the first Cold War. So the Biden administration is continuing this policy of containment and siege and Cold War against China. This study at the RAND Corporation, it also went country by country looking at the U.S. treaty allies in the Pacific region and talks about their specific circumstances. This is a very short summary. It notes that, quote, "It is highly unlikely that Thailand, the Philippines, or the Republic of Korea would agree to host U.S. ground-based intermediate-range missiles. And there is a small likelihood that Australia or Japan would do so, although the possibility that an agreement might be struck with Tokyo is only slightly greater." So here is a summary of these 5 countries that are U.S. treaty allies in the Pacific. They say Thailand it's highly unlikely to accept because it notes that the Thai government shows a propensity to pursue closer ties with China. So Thailand is leaning toward China, so it's very unlikely to allow these missiles to be installed. It also notes that the Philippines is extremely unlikely to accept the deployment of these U.S. missiles, noting that the U.S. alliance with the Philippines is in a state of flux, although it is improving. And it notes, the RAND Corporation noted that the current Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte, pursued policies that negatively affect ties with the U.S. Specifically, Duterte advocated closer ties with Beijing while pursuing policies that weaken core pillars of the U.S.-Philippine alliance. Now, this is being a little generous to Duterte. Duterte basically had this policy of playing China and the U.S. against each other. Saying that he was pro-China is being too generous. He played the two countries against each other. He was very inconsistent. But the RAND Corporation noted that Philippine elites generally support the United States and want to improve allies with the U.S. And now there is a new president who was just elected president-elect named Bongbong Marcos. He is the son of the former dictator, the U.S.-backed right-wing dictator of the Philippines. And it's not clear what his policies will be, but the fact that he's the son, it suggests that maybe that he will improve U.S. relations with the Philippines and strengthen that alliance against China. We'll see what Bongbong Marcos does. Now here's South Korea. This is interesting. South Korea, which is officially known as the Republic of Korea, the ROK, the RAND Corporation points out that it still retains a close relationship with China, and the study concluded that, quote, "A general deterioration of U.S.-South Korean relations suggests that it is highly unlikely that it would consent to host these U.S. missiles." I should point out, however, that the Republic of Korea just elected a right-wing, very conservative, very pro-war, very anti-China leader, and he may improve relations with the U.S. and may really aggressively take actions against China. So we will see how that goes. Now, Australia, which is not in Asia, but it is in the Pacific region, the U.S. alliance with Australia is strong. Australia also remains economically close to China, but their bilateral ties have been fraying, the RAND Corporation wrote. But they note that Australia has a historical reluctance to host permanent foreign military bases, and it's geopolitically far from the continent of Asia, making the possibility of it hosting these U.S. missiles unlikely. So finally, the RAND Corporation concluded its report saying that the most likely ally would be Japan. However, the possibility of Japan hosting these ground-based intermediate-range missiles still remains low, heavily caveated by the challenge of accepting any increase in U.S. presence and deploying weapons that are explicitly offensive in nature. So this is the report. It shows, once again, here's the map, that the U.S. military is planning on spending $27 billion to try to install a series of missiles to wage war on China, instead of using that money to fund healthcare and education and houses and poverty reduction programs. Instead of helping people in the United States, the U.S. military is trying to start a conventional war with China, the largest country in terms of population on Earth, a massive nuclear-armed superpower. So there's only one problem. The countries in the region don't want to host these missiles because they don't want to be the casual fallout, the collateral damage of a U.S. war on China.